Welcome to the New York Business Leaders Podcast, presented by the Coyle Group. We interview the most interesting and influential business leaders in New York and hear their stories of success, challenges, and lessons learned while building their businesses and personal brands. New episodes drop weekly, so please be sure to subscribe to get updates in your favorite stream. Without further delay, here's your host of the New York Business Leaders Podcast, Gordon Coyle.
This week's show is an interesting first, as I have two guests on at the same time to discuss a business topic that all three of us are passionate about, and that is cybersecurity. I'm joined by my good friends Brian David and Steve Ward for this conversation. Brian is the managing director at the Lloyd Group, a managed services provider focused on mid-market firms, and Steve is the CEO of Polaris Risk Management. Steve's firm provides physical and digital security to a variety of firms and organizations globally. This three-way conversation banters around cyber threats, cybersecurity, risk assessments, readiness, how to treat the threats we face today, how to think about those threats, and ultimately how to contain them. I'm sure we've only scratched the surface when it comes to the broad topic of cybersecurity and will likely need a follow-up conversation in the near future. But this is an important discussion for any business owner, corporate leader, or decision maker to hear. We're not pitching any products or services during this discussion, but hopefully opening the minds of those who will listen to my cyber evangelist friends. The threats are very real and evolving for firms of all sizes. What's frightening to me is the rapid pace of that evolvement and the potency of the threats and the damages they can inflict on firms and organizations of all sizes. The contact info for Brian and Steve and myself will appear in the show notes if you'd like to reach any of us to discuss your particular concerns regarding cyber risk and how we can assist you. Finally, if you have an interesting story that you'd like to tell on this podcast, please drop me an email and let's chat. Also, give it a thumbs up on YouTube and a 5-star rating on the platform you're listening to this on. I'd really appreciate it. Thanks. Now, on to the show. Hey everyone, I'm Gordon Coyle. Welcome to the New York Business Leaders Podcast. Today we've got a bit of a different conversation going on. I've got two guests on, Steve Ward and Brian David. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in just a minute. But we're going to be very focused around the conversation of cyber threat, cyber risk, specifically around ransomware. And these two guys are experts in their fields. I'm going to kind of help moderate the conversation and talk a little bit about cyber insurance, but we're going to talk about this from the perspective of business owners, large and small, and what's going on today. So with that, I'm going to toss it over to Steve. Do you want to do a quick intro and then we'll go to Brian?
Sure. Thank you, Gordon. My name is Steve Ward. I'm the CEO and principal of Polaris Corporate Risk. We're a holistic risk management firm that deals with both physical and cyber risks, and we represent clients in multiple market sectors, helping them ferret out risks and defend against cyber intrusion as well as physical security issues.
Thanks. Brian?
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. Brian David, Managing Director of the Lloyd Group. We are a managed services provider specializing in IT strategy, fractional CIO consulting, cybersecurity and risk, and digital transformation. We typically work with firms that are greater than 100 employees up to about 1,000, typically have some internal IT. We also work with firms that are less than 100 with no internal IT that typically outsource all of their technology needs primarily to a firm like ours.
Great, thanks. And I'll just kind of throw in that for those that haven't maybe listened to this podcast in the past, my name is Gordon Coyle. I'm the president and CEO of the Coyle Group, which is a regional boutique commercial insurance brokerage and risk management consulting firm. And cyber insurance is a big thing that we do every day. So good to get this thing going. Brian, why don't you start us off with what you're seeing in the marketplace when you're speaking with clients or prospective clients, the kinds of risks and concerns, fears, and issues that these folks are kind of seeing every day?
Sure. So I think historically firms, both small and mid-size, have reached out to us for a number of reasons, and they still do for these reasons today: lack of IT strategy, lack of support and response, a poor relationship with the company that they're working with, or a combination of all those things. But really, the number one reason as to why companies reach out to us today is around cybersecurity and risk. And as much as we would love it that those firms are reaching out more in a more positive state, in most cases they've either are going through some type of security breach, or have recently gone through a breach. And the sad part is these firms are led to believe that, because they've made some investments in some tools and technology, that their security posture is in a good place. So maybe an investment in multi-factor authentication, maybe endpoint detection and response, something around those, but never really, I think, given the type of consulting needed to help build a more holistic and sound security posture. And so typically when we come in, we find that there's really three things that a firm needs to invest in to properly secure themselves. Policy and process are big. So things like having a written information security policy in place, training and resources for staff. This is really important. Sort of low-hanging fruit there is, phishing testing, doing that at least on a quarterly basis. And then the last one is around tools and technology. So things around implementing a SIM, security information and event management, or tools around investing in ransomware, and not just necessarily the tools, but going through the appropriate due diligence. And I think that's where Steve's about to talk about, his readiness assessment, which I think really covers a large portion of setting yourself up for success.
Before we jump into the readiness assessment, I just want to kind of ask, do you think that a lot of business owners and business leaders kind of came into the last couple of years with the thought of, okay, I've got, my IT is set, my system is set, I don't really have to worry about it. And they never thought of this as an ongoing investment of time and money and technology, all the things that you mentioned. How did it creep up on people to kind of like, oops, maybe everything isn't as good as we thought it was?
Yeah, we hear that quite a bit. We'll come in and someone will say that they did a penetration test 3 years ago or 2 years ago and everything was fine, or they remediated some of the findings from that particular test, or they went through a network upgrade and they made some investments a few years ago. But security is a living, breathing thing. There's new threats every day, and you really need to be building a budget around the investment in cyber on the three things that I'd mentioned previously: training, policy, and tools and technology. And those are going to need to be reviewed and audited and updated at least on an annual basis. This is not a set it and forget it type scenario.
And maybe, Steve, this is where you can come in and talk a little bit about how ransomware has become so sophisticated, software as a service, and also maybe can you give us a little bit of a background on your readiness assessment as well?
Sure. So dovetailing off what Brian had discussed is, companies like Polaris and myself, we're not typically your managed security provider or your managed service provider. We work hand in glove with them. And the reality is, hitting on what you said, Gordon, is that, most business owners or most businesses think they're safe, but they're really not sure. And what tests do they do to assess it? So for today's discussion, we're hitting ransomware because we see it all over the news. We've heard that the president of the United States said ransomware is similar to terrorism, and he wants to designate a number of resources. Actually, today he announced there's 352 weaknesses that he wants fixed in the next 90 days within the US government. So this is a situation where it hits every business, whether it be an automotive business, whether it be a bakery, whether it be a pharmaceutical company. And what we see when we're brought in, either from the incident response side, which is after the incident happens, and everyone thought everything was great, but no one really knew, or to where we have been moving and migrating our clients to, is the ransomware readiness assessment, which is assessing your biggest threat. And if you were to look in the news today and you Google ransomware, it will come up significantly. There's been over 2,000 incidences that have been reported. That's not how many that have taken place, and it's 62% jump year over year. So what we try to do is say to our clients is that there's a number of threats across the spectrum with cyber, but the one that's the most eminent threat right now is ransomware. So let's look at your environment. Let's do a readiness assessment. Let's not just hope all those tools you have in place and that penetration test you have hasn't changed and your dynamics haven't changed. And let's look at your risk. Let's look at your risk assessment. Let's look at your environment. Let's create a risk score for you. Let's do a simulation. And in this simulation, we're going to use the tools that are typically used in a ransomware attack, a spear phishing or phishing and farming campaign, an attempt to access your system and create lateral movement. We may do this with the managed service provider being aware. We may do it without the managed service provider being aware. And then from there, we do a review of your response, because every company, and Brian and I can talk about this as well, should have these policies and protocols in place about how you respond to the incident. And the key is to get down to the response of the incident. How well did you plan for this? What are the tools you're using to protect yourself? How did you respond in the simulation? And then, another factor goes back to your area is, Gordon, is the insurance, which is a key factor in every assessment. And, you can explain a little bit about the insurance, because many times we find clients that believe they're insured and they're covered for ransomware, and they don't understand that there are specific products set up for all different cyber security threats.
So that's a great promo entry. He didn't
I think we're all promoting. I think we're all promoting each other, right?
There you go. He didn't tee that up too much. But yeah, I think it's an important point. And honestly, a lot of business owners that we speak with, they believe, their business insurance covers the result, or the cost and the impact of a cyber event, and it doesn't. Some business owners' policies can have a small endorsement tacked onto a policy, but I will say that all of those, very limited coverage, the scope of what's covered is very limited, and the limits of what are provided for those threats is very limited. So every business does need a separate cyber insurance policy. And that doesn't matter if you've got, a 2-person accounting firm or a 200-person manufacturing firm. And I want to kind of talk about that for a minute as well, that cyber threat is indiscriminate. I think Brian once explained to me that some guy in Russia can be sitting in his kitchen in his underwear, executing thousands of phishing emails every minute of the day, and all he has to do is hit on 1 or 2 of them in a day, and he's made a lot of money. Unlike the old-fashioned hackers that had to kind of infiltrate your system to steal data and then sell it for pennies on the dollar on the dark web. It's a totally different model. So maybe you guys can kind of give us some perspective around the clients that, and I'll give you one quick story to kick it off, is it really doesn't matter. I just spoke to somebody who had a ransomware attack last year, a small firm. I think there were, I'm looking for my notes, I think there was, 5 people in the company, and they don't even know how it happened. But it wasn't an email campaign. It seemed to have been a backdoor campaign that got into their system. The initial ransom demand was $80,000. They had no cyber insurance, and they were able to negotiate it with the hackers down to $25,000. And when I asked how long did it take, the CEO said it took about 2 weeks to get to the point of getting our data back. And I said, and how did you know your data was all clean? And there was no answer to that question. So it's kind of a scary thing. The costs go all over the ballpark, but I think a lot of business owners kind of believe this only happens to big companies. So could you guys give us some intel on dispelling that myth?
Sure, I'll jump in, and then Brian, you can jump in after if you're good with that. We had an example of a car dealership. This is a company that did not think of cyber as a big threat to them. They own 2 or 3 dealerships. They have service departments. And to get to the crux of it, they didn't understand what ransomware is. And many people really don't. So in layman's terms, ransomware is that someone infiltrates your network through either an email, which is called phishing or spear phishing or farming, or even gets into it through phone calls and sends malicious code, and they lock you out. So you go into work, you can't get into your email, you can't get into your computers, your phones are shut down. in this case, he couldn't get into his database, which had all the incoming vehicles that they were going to get. They weren't able to get the parts orders, but even more damaging is they had the email addresses of their clients. And if the cyber criminals sent an email out, it would look like it was coming from his business. So there was a significant issue here. One of the things that we look at is when we look at the code or the malicious code, we can identify what type of ransomware attack it is and what group is sending it. And what's changed in the industry is that it's not a cyber group per se. What they're doing is they're creating these malicious codes and renting them out to lesser sophisticated criminals. So you want to make sure that you look at the statistics of how many times you pay that you get the information back. And that's just one example where they were shut down for a whole week. And it cost them a significant amount of money to get everything back up and create redundancy moving forward. Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned it earlier. The majority of the prospective clients that reach out to us these days it's because of a recent breach or because they're going through that type of breach. And typically what we find is that they've been relying on either internal IT or even a managed services provider to be their one-stop shop around security. And I think the biggest thing of this is that they haven't thought beyond just traditional IT services and looking at a firm like Steve's, where you're hiring, and getting the benefit of two companies, right? So Steve's firm comes in, he does the incident management piece, he basically builds the roadmap. And then firms like Lloyd come in and help out with things around remediation and helping to implement the actual roadmap that's developed. And firms like ours working hand in hand, but you need to rely on a managed services provider to help start and kickstart that conversation. Right. And what we typically find, that's not the case. There's a lot of firms we talk to, they don't have governance built in, they don't have an IT steering committee. They're not talking about these topics. They're talking about, really just one-offs here and there. It's kind of whack-a-mole scenario rather than really focusing on an overall IT strategy inclusive of cybersecurity and risk. And a lot of times it takes not just, it's beyond just a managed services provider, beyond your CIO. You really need somebody that's truly focused on the security side, that's sitting at that table, that's sitting with, leadership and talking to them and educating them about the risks associated, with cyber today. And Steve's, hit on, ransomware is significant. That's probably 90% of the prospective clients we talk to, their breach is related to ransomware.
So you kind of brought up a good point. And I think if we kind of looked at this from two sides of different coins, you guys are very proactive defense mechanisms, whereas insurance is really just reactive. I mean, there is some benefit to the insurance, especially for smaller firms, that'll help the training and the awareness piece of it. But insurance becomes a reactive mechanism when all else falls apart. And that kind of leads me to the next question. That is, let's talk about the costs. And again, we have to kind of scale it from the small bakery on the corner to the car dealership with 3 locations and doing several $1 million a year in sales. What's the average cost in your opinions and what you've seen in terms of a ransomware attack that hits a business?
Steve, you want to take it?
Sure. So from my end, it could be a baseline of 25,000 is where you're starting. And unless you have a provider like the Lloyd Group that has built-in provisions to have backups, have your offsite backups, have all these different verticals that you need, that you can either not pay the ransom, negotiate the ransomware, or have someone negotiate the ransomware down. You're looking at a minimum of like a $25,000 incident response for a firm like mine to get involved across the board. And then after that, you have to realize that you've been targeted and someone else will target you down the road. And that doesn't even bring in the insurance aspect, because we do know, and Gordon, I think you can go back on this later, is that a lot of companies put a lot of information in those applications that isn't accurate. And when the insurance company comes in and sees it's not accurate, they deny coverage.
Yeah, there are some policy forms that do rely on the application as what we call a warranty to coverage. But there are some today that don't warranty that data, but being accurate is going to be really important. So just to jump back to you, Steve, and we'll go on to Brian in a second. 25,000 minimum ransom demand, 25,000 incident remediation. One question I've got for you guys is, in ransom events, is the requirement for notification triggered or is it not?
To your insurance carrier or to your shareholders? A lot of companies don't.
No. To the record holders. Is it? Do you have to have a demand for?
Yeah, and that type of notification should be outlined in a written information security policy.
So just
all the partners that you typically work with. So Gordon, you would be listed as cyber insurance. You would have your cyber attorney listed in there. That's where you'd have your incident management procedures, who you'd contact in the event of a breach, and the actual the manner in which you're reaching out. So the order in which you're reaching out to these people to notify them. I would say before you get to that stage where you're notifying, shareholders or clients, you really want to talk to your trusted advisors first to evaluate the situation and understand where you are, right? Because you don't want to be too early by submitting something and causing a panic. You want to get educated on really what's happening, the type of breach that has occurred, and then understand what the steps are involved in then connecting to your external community.
And in many cases, if the client has cyber insurance, there is a sublimit or a limit of insurance for crisis management. So you can be connected to the right people to give you the advice on that. But when I was talking, just to clarify, when I was talking about notification, I was talking about FTC notification to record holders where the records may have been compromised. And I'm not sure of that. So that's why I was really asking.
I can give you a little overview. So there's safe harbor laws for every different state. So each state has different requirements for you contacting the potentially compromised victim. And then keep in mind, there's costs, because in some states you're required to take them, put them on LifeLock or Life Alert, one of those, so that people are constantly monitoring their credit report. Now, you may say, okay, that's only $15 a person, but depending on how many people that have been compromised, it could be significant. And I will tell you, one of the targets has been hospitality. Hotels are infinite for having free Wi-Fi, and hotels, when they get hit, even if it's a smaller hotel chain, think about the number of people's information they have in. Now, some of them get away with the fact that it may be erroneously entered, so they don't have the right information of the person. But there's, like Brian said, you want to have those people like your lawyer, your cyber lawyer, to guide you through this, because in some cases, if the information's not complete, you don't have to go down the rabbit hole of finding these people to notify them. But it can be very expensive in the long run, depending on how many people and how many clients. And then you deal with the ramifications to your brand that someone says, I've been doing business with this company for all these years, and now all my personal information's out there. Yeah. So it can be problematic.
And I think that the message really is around taking a more proactive approach. Like Steve and I, again, I've talked about this, that we're brought in typically in the event of a breach. And so I think what we're trying to preach here, for a lack of a better way of putting it, is to take a more proactive approach to putting all of these steps in place so that in the event that something, should occur, you're very prepared, you have the information, it's not panic mode and you're trying to figure out and you've got your entire leadership team and all these people together, but you're actually managing that breach in a controlled state.
And that's what the written information security plan does, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. So for the listeners, I'll fess up and say that we had a pre-call just so we could line out who was going to say what and how we were going to cover this. And I said, I'm going to use the line from Mike Tyson, so I'm going to toss it in now, that, everybody thinks they have a plan until they're punched in the face. And I think it's very appropriate in this conversation because, all kidding aside, when a cyber event, especially a ransomware event, happens, whether it's a small business or a larger firm, everybody in that firm is running around with their hair on fire because they're out of business. And I think that that's something that we really have to make clear, is that in a ransomware event, you are out of business. Every company today, whether it's, we've mentioned a few, car dealerships, bakery, auto mechanic, auto dealership, whatever business you're in, your business runs on your network, right? If you can't access your network, you can't service a customer, you can't bill a customer, you can't really do anything. You can't get to your data. So you're of course going to be running around with your hair on fire. And
Gordon, you'd be surprised at how many prospective clients if I ask, do you have a written information security policy in place? And they think that they do, and they'll say yes. And when I ask them what they have, and it's really an acceptable usage policy, an AUP, that's built into their employee handbook, and it's a few paragraphs.
Yeah.
And it nowhere meets the needs of the criteria, for what you need in place to protect yourself and to help yourself through a breach.
Yeah, and I guess really the point is if you want to recover from an event, you need to be prepared for it.
Correct.
And one key factor, Gordon, is that when Brian's talking about this plan, there needs to be buy-in by senior leadership in governance. Because if the senior leadership doesn't take ownership, no one's going to take it serious. But at the end of the day, the senior leadership are the ones that are going to have to answer when something like this happens. And we saw what happened with the Colonial Pipeline ransomware, where oil was shut down for half the country. Gas was nowhere to be found. I mean, these types of things will become more and more prevalent. Recently, there's a new one that's targeting M&A deals. So they're focusing. I've heard ones about smart buildings, where they can get into a smart building and control the elevators, control the heat. So now all of a sudden you have a commercial landlord that says to all its tenants, you can't come to work until we figure this out because we can't run our elevators, we can't run the heat. So this is, this is something that's not going away, and it's going to continue to fester and grow.
Mm-hmm. And as the Internet of Things continues to embed itself in every aspect of our lives, it becomes even riskier.
Yes.
Yeah, and in an M&A deal, when you're at that point to make the announcement, you're now effectively a target.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So Brian, you mentioned just a little earlier about, or maybe Steve did, I'm sorry, about backups. We've heard, I've heard clients say, my system is bulletproof, I've got backups, I've got this and that, and I'm sure you guys have heard it too. Let's say a client has a good, solid backup strategy, air gap, the whole 9 yards. Is that an effective strategy to defend yourself against ransomware?
I'll let Brian explain the nuances of trying to restore backup that has never been.
Yeah, and I will. Yeah, I mean, no, it's not. I mean, your goal should be prevention, right? Certainly having a good backup in place, but I would say that 9 out of 10 times even that is questionable. Just kind of like a written information security policy, people think they have them in place, they think they have a good backup, and in this business, it's all about evidence. And when I ask when's the last time you've actually tested a restore of any kind, and they have no idea, and it never happened. And so, same thing. It is a recurring. You have to build this into some type of cadence where you're testing a restore on an ongoing basis, and you know that it works. And along with that, you should have a well documented business continuity and disaster recovery plan in place. And that's another thing that we typically find. People think that because they have a backup, that's enough because it's in the cloud, but it doesn't necessarily address, in the event that you actually have to invoke disaster recovery, how does that work? How does my staff work? What's the process involved? Who actually does the work and takes the steps to invoke DR? And who from my firm is involved in that process? So similar to in the event of a breach, a disaster, we find same thing. People aren't necessarily prepared for that. But a good step, certainly having a backup in place is very effective. But that is nowhere near, something that you want to build your security posture around, that you have good backup.
Right.
And, Gordon, one thing to keep in mind is that I've been involved, and so has Brian, actually. We worked on projects together where after the environment had been compromised, the backup and all the encryption passwords were on someone's computer. So those backups were then subsequently rendered useless because the infringer had taken control of them. So, there's standards, and every company has to assess how they can meet those standards. And that's where you work with your managed service provider, as well as an outside cybersecurity company like Polaris. We're not the only two out there, but you put into effect, when you do your risk assessment, what are your critical issues? What are the long-term goals, and how do you get there? And these are the type of things you talk about in that simulation of, okay, did we try to restore a backup tape? Well, 6 IT guys ago, we did that once. And, some are taped, some are here, some's in the cloud. And, the key is, don't rely on the idea that you're going to be able to back it all up and get your business back up and running from a third-party site very quickly.
Yeah.
And look, in the event of a breach, regardless of whether we get backup or not, you're still making a rush. Steve talked about the incident management piece of it, but on top of that, you have lost employee productivity. Then you have, corporate goals of probably ongoing projects that are going to have to stop. Security is going to take top priority, and then you're rushing to remediate, right? And remediation includes not just, you're patching some holes, but now you're making investments for things that you may not have budgeted for and are prepared to implement. And you've got to shift all of your resources, including on the leadership team, that are now moving towards this new initiative that you hadn't planned for. It is extremely disruptive. It is extremely expensive. And again, that's why we're preaching a proactive model. We talk about the fact that we have incident response in place. Steve, his firm focuses on a large part of their business, but he and I will both agree that we'll take the client that comes to us in a more controlled state that is working with us to build a proactive scenario than taking on a client where, for lack of a better way of putting it, shit has hit the fan. Mm-hmm. Right? Because it's a very disruptive. It's disruptive for our businesses and it's disruptive for theirs. So our goal is to try to get to people before an actual breach occurs.
And something I think Steve mentioned earlier is your reputational damages. We've seen situations where a client suffers a breach, and a day or two later, after it's been kind of communicated or it's out in the news, especially if it's a high-end client, and their clients are like, I can't trust you to do business. I can't do business with you any longer because I can't trust you that you've got belt and suspenders on everything. And now all of a sudden you suffer a significant loss of revenue due to these reputational damages. And I think that's, when you look at this in a holistic fashion, from what it costs to remediate a breach to what it's going to cost, like you just mentioned, Brian, about ongoing business operations, distraction, disruption, everything like that. Now you've got the real potential loss of revenue. So you've got, huge costs that could be incurred and loss of revenue at the same time. It really adds up to being a demand for being more proactive around it. I just think that a lot of business owners aren't schooled, for lack of a better term, around what the risks are. And I think it's important for anybody who's listening to this or watching this kind of conversation is ask questions. If your MSP is not, accessible, if they're not having these conversations with you, if you don't have somebody like Steve and his firm, if you don't have an insurance broker that's proactive and can have this conversation, it may be time to start thinking about a different set of vendors and professionals to surround yourself with. But this is a conversation that needs to be taking place.
I agree. One of the things Brian mentioned earlier, and when we talked, is that security, where even if you do all the things we're talking about, it doesn't mean you're done. Security has to evolve and grow with your business. Threats will continue to grow. You can go through every single motion and every single focus of security, and you could still wind up being breached. But the question is how prepared you are to respond to it. And we all should look at it as we're all a target.
Yeah. I mean, I've said it before, it's not if, it's really when you're going to get hit.
Right.
Having the proactive resources, tools, and everything, as well as the backstop of insurance, I think is important for every business, regardless of their size, their industry, or how well they handle security. Before we go, I just want to touch on a subject we really didn't spend any time on, and that is training. What is training with regard to cybersecurity awareness? Do you guys want to talk about that for a minute?
Sure.
Brian, why don't you start from yours, because it all starts, I think it starts with the managed service provider, and then I can give you an idea what we would do outside of that.
Sure. So I think, I mentioned this earlier, standard phishing testing, and again, it's continuous. We typically recommend for our clients that they're doing some type of security training or going through a phishing test at least once a quarter. And then with regards to training, implementing some type of tool that walks you through an education process of things that you should be looking for and should be concerned about. If you see a suspicious email, taking a look at the email address, who the sender is. You certainly want to have external email set up so that it flags that the email is coming from the outside. So if it does have a familiar name of somebody within your firm, it should flag and should tell you that this is actually not coming from internal, it's coming from external. These are the types of things that you want to build in a training program and continue to reinforce, right? Because people forget, they go back to their day jobs. And so if you're not doing that on a regular basis, you're just opening up the door for the likelihood of a breach, because most breaches typically happen, non-maliciously inside the firm. And other things associated with proper tools that you implement around training. You want to distribute something like a written information security policy and other types of policies, at least on an annual basis. You want to update those and distribute them to your staff. And you want to have a tool that allows you to see who actually within your firm went through the process of actually reading it and signing off on that policy. And of course, in conjunction with that, you want to build that into any orientation and onboarding programs for new employees. You want to make sure that they're going through that same type of training and reviewing the same types of policies. And again, you're consistently updating them and moving them forward on an annual basis.
Great. Steve?
And then we focus on the executive leadership or the senior management to do a day or two of training, and we do the train the trainer model, whereas it's great to have all of these policies in place, but if the executive leadership doesn't know what the policies are and doesn't understand the risk, how are they going to push it down to their staff? So you need to have those in play. And we do a train the training. It could be a 1 day or 2 day seminar where we teach them about the vulnerabilities, what they should know about, what their environment is set up, some of their rules. We try to show them the best practices for an organization in their market segment, and then also what they have in place so that key individuals from that management team can take what they learned from us and drill it down to everyone in the organization. And then quarterly trainings, which can be after management has buy-in. You may have your mid-level managers, you may have your people that are most active in certain markets or which are high threat markets, have a quick half-day training where someone comes in and says, this is what we're seeing. Instead of just giving them that email, which they may read and click off, have someone stand in front of them and explain it to them and try to see if you're reaching them. And this is key, obviously, in every organization, but it doesn't take a lot of time. And it can, start creating a security culture. And that's what you want to do, is have a security mindset when it comes to cybersecurity.
I think that's important. Culture of,
Yeah.
thinking things through.
Yes.
Brian, going back to the training, the phishing training, I don't want business owners to think that they have to create the wheel of like how this goes. You can purchase that through your firm, or it's like a packaged sort of a training process, correct?
Yeah, there's a number of ways that you can implement training. If you have, it depending on the type of training. Steve specializes, like he said, he's got 1 to 2 day trainers on site. There's quarterly training that you can do online. We would typically, I think Steve would agree with this. We'd recommend that you didn't rely on internal IT. I think this is one of those things that you want to have outside of your IT team. I think a lot of things associated with security, and we'd recommend outside of your managed services provider, right? That's where someone like Steve comes in to help hold a firm like ours accountable. We're basically overseeing and managing everything, and it's always great to have an expert like Polaris to come in and hold us accountable, right? And then report together to the client and review the results and make sure that things are moving forward in a positive direction. And then we're coming in to remediate.
Got it. So guys, it's been a great conversation. I appreciate you both being here today to talk about this issue of ransomware. Is there anything we didn't hit on that you want to kind of kick into it before we wrap up?
From my
I don't think
perspective,
so.
I think we hit everything. I think we hit everything there is. Yeah.
So I got to.
I have like, it's like a checkbox of like things to cover, and I'm out.
I was going to say, folks, that's the first time I've seen Brian David and Steve Ward agree so readily with each other. So if people who are watching or listening to this show want to get in touch with you, Steve, let's start with you. What's the best way to get in touch with you?
Sure. You can contact us through our website, which is PolarisRSK.com, and there's an info at PolarisRSK.com. And that would be the main line that's advertised on the website, where you can reach out and you can contact one of our analysts, and we can help you or guide you along the way, see if we're your best partner.
Great. Brian, if people wanted to get in touch with you, how's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, you can go to our website, lloydgroup.com, or you can look us up on LinkedIn. Those are probably the two best places to connect with us, learn about us. If you're interested in learning more about employment opportunities at Lloyd Group, Glassdoor is a great place to go. We're very proud of our Glassdoor rating and our score about our NPS score associated with Glassdoor.
Cool. I'll put your contact info in the show notes, so if somebody wants to reach you and they're not readily near a pen, they can do that from the show notes. Guys, I appreciate you spending the time here today with us, talking about a very important topic. I think we'll probably have a follow-up to this conversation not too far down the road. So thanks very much. My name is Gordon Coyle. I'm the host of the New York Business Leaders Podcast. If you have an interesting story that you'd like to tell on this show, give me a call, drop me an email. My info will also be in the show notes. Until next time, see ya.
Thanks, Gordon.
Thank you, Gordon.
Thanks, Steve.
All right.
Thanks, Brian.
That's it for this week's episode of the New York Business Leaders Podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode. In the meantime, find more interviews and resources at nybusinessleaders.com.